Good evening. As we start tonight, I acknowledge the custodians of this land that we are meeting on, Aboriginal elders past and present. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to life in the city and in our Hunter region. Welcome to the Newcastle launch of Suzanne Smith's extraordinary book, The Altar Boys. Would you please put your hands together? My name's Dan Cox. I co-host ABC Newcastle Breakfast, and I first met Susie when we covered the 2013 Canine Special Commission into allegations the local Catholic Church had covered up abuse. She quickly became more than a colleague. She's a friend and a mentor, and it's an honour to host tonight's event for her. A special welcome to the Walsh, Alwood and Nash families tonight. Glenn, Stephen and Andrew are the main characters in Susie's book, and we understand the collateral damage of this epidemic of clerical sexual abuse through their eyes. If you know Susie, it won't surprise you that she has put so much work into investigating, researching, talking about and writing this narrative non-fiction, and you'll hear from her tonight, and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask some questions. For an official welcome to tonight's launch and to our city, if you're visiting, welcome. Representing Newcastle's Lord Mayor is Councillor Carol Duncan. Please welcome Councillor Duncan.
Dan, thank you very much and good evening. I'm delighted to join you for tonight's event on behalf of the City of Newcastle and very proud to be representing our Lord Mayor, Nuatali Nelms. Unfortunately, the Lord Mayor has an apology this evening due to the recent sudden death of her younger sister. But she has asked me to pass on her best wishes to Susie and to all of you for coming along and joining to support Susie for tonight's important launch. She also asked me to pass on her thoughts and best wishes to the memory of one of the people who will be spoken about this evening, because I know that for Mark and Stephen, the Lord Mayor was due to speak at your wedding in 2018, just I think 5 weeks after the death. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm very grateful that the Lord Mayor has asked me to come here and represent her this evening. I also acknowledge tonight that we're joined by Sharon Claydon MP, the federal member for Newcastle, and Sharon, as I'm sure most of you would know, has been an enormous advocate for justice for the victims of child sexual abuse, serving the Commonwealth as the chair of the Joint Select Committee for the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, and currently serving as the deputy chair for the committee regarding the implementation of the National Redress Scheme. I acknowledge the Honourable David Shoebridge, MLC, member of the New South Wales Legislative Council, is also with us this evening, and welcome also to Ms Wendy Hughes, the former Lady Mayoress of the City of Newcastle. Many of my former colleagues from the media who have come along tonight, and other members from the Newcastle community as well. Thank you so much for being here. Mostly, I think though, and very importantly, I want to acknowledge those victims of child sexual abuse, their friends and their families, and I acknowledge the whistleblowers who exposed these heinous crimes and acknowledge the injustice that many of these brave people experienced as a result of taking a stand against child sexual abuse. I note that Patricia Feenan is here tonight with her son Daniel, and I had the great privilege during my radio career of interviewing Patricia when she released her book Holy Hell. And Patricia, that interview stays with me, and the trauma of your experience stays with me as a mother, and I guess as a civic representative as well. It is incumbent upon me and all of us every day to ensure that we protect young people. It is, though, a great pleasure to assist with tonight's launch, and I have the honour of also being a former colleague of Susie's, and I note that there are many here tonight who are also former colleagues of Susie's. Susie's a 6-time Walkley Award-winning journalist, and I would best describe Susie as fearless. And it's at a time like this, now, more than ever, that we need our journalists to be fearless and to be honest. The Altar Boys is an important investigation and documentation of the calculated and organised nature of child sexual abuse right here in Newcastle. And it's important that these crimes are talked about and are known and acknowledged. I've forgotten to mention that Peter Fox is also here in the room with us this evening. Peter, thank you so much for being here. It's important that the extent and the pervasiveness of these crimes is acknowledged. And to a former colleague who told me here in Newcastle nearly 30 years ago that his school in Newcastle had been hellish, but he never went into details with me. I'm sorry, because now I know. On behalf of the City of Newcastle, I say we acknowledge your pain, we acknowledge your suffering, and we acknowledge the catastrophic effects that child sexual abuse has on every victim, their loved ones, and on our communities. We will listen to you and we will believe you. But once again, welcome to Newcastle City Hall, and on behalf of the City of Newcastle, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Time now to hear from David Shoebridge. He's a Greens MP in the New South Wales Parliament and has been serving in the state's upper house for 10 years now. He's the Greens spokesman for child protection and has been a big part of the campaign to shine a light on this issue in our region in particular. It's my pleasure to welcome him to Newcastle and the stage. Please put your hands together for David Shoebridge.
Thanks very much for that, Dan. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the custodians of this land upon which we gather here today. And as all of our state is, this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. But I'd also like to acknowledge all the survivors and the victims, the family members who are here today. And many of you I've met at different stages through this journey, and it's been quite a journey. And just to acknowledge the collective courage and strength that you've all shown, and courage and strength and perseverance when an institution that was often central to many of your lives failed you and your family and your friends. And I do start with that acknowledgement. And I also acknowledge the journalists, the police, the campaigners, the supporters, the advocates who have been fighting this for so long, and for so long fighting it isolated and in an atmosphere which even 10 years ago was one where there was this blanket of shame and this sense that the institution that had done so much wrong was all powerful and persuasive, including in my workplace in the New South Wales Parliament. And I was just saying to Susie earlier, it was 7 years ago that I first met Susie, and some of that extraordinary work, initial work she did in this space, with the likes of Peter Fox, who I think is here tonight on Lateline. And just 7 years ago, it seemed that the institutions of the Catholic Church still owned a fair chunk of the New South Wales Parliament. And it felt like some of those players, the Cardinal Pells and others, would continue to silence victims, to maintain legal and political institutions that would protect the church and its assets. And if I think about the journey we've had in the last 7 years to 10 years, what an extraordinary achievement you collectively have done. What an extraordinary achievement. But there is still so much more to do. And while we're in Newcastle and we're talking about some of those brave voices and campaigners, I can't but note the extraordinary work and the achievements and the bravery of Joanne McCarthy as well, and the work that she did. But I do want to just turn to this extraordinary book, The Altar Boys, by Suzanne Smith. Suzanne will tell you the circumstances in which she was compelled to write this book, and I don't think Susie had any choice. But that's Susie's story. But what I would like to address quickly is one of the most powerful parts of this book is the story of this extraordinary whistleblower priest, Father Glenn Walsh. And Father Glenn Walsh, as a whistleblower priest, is almost unheard of in this story of silence and complicity and violence, and for the crime of standing up and going to the police against the wishes of his bishop, going to the police and telling the truth about the violence and the abuse and the systemic nature of it in his church, which he loved. Telling the truth of that to the police saw him ostracised and shunned and excluded from the church that he loved. Literally sent from the diocese, this diocese, where he grew up with families like the Nashes. Shunned for the crime of telling the truth to the police. And in a communication as recently as yesterday, the church to all of its schools and its school communities, in response to the launch of Susie's book and to a gathering of survivors and victims yesterday outside the cathedral, said this is all about the past. It's all about what happened decades ago. And it's not. Because Father Glenn Walsh took his life just a short 3 years ago. And he took his life in circumstances where every element in the church's hierarchy was still working against him actively as recently as 3 years ago. He had been shunned from his own diocese, refused a parish. And he did have some colleagues and friends, and you can read about that in the book. One priest on his side asking if he could be returned to this diocese, and he was refused that by the current bishop. Not a bishop of 10 years ago, but the current bishop. And this isn't 2000 or 1980. We're talking 3 years ago. And in that same time frame, once Glenn had been identified as a crown witness against an archbishop of the church, no less a person than the current Pope, Pope Francis, recalls him to Rome and interrogates him in the Vatican about what his evidence will be and why he's giving evidence against an archbishop. These aren't matters just of the past. This is an institution that Susie's book shows has still not learned the lessons of the Royal Commission. This is an institution that was still refusing a whistleblower priest even a most basic payment like a stipend, let alone a place in his own diocese. And to think that the church can still be claiming that this is a matter of history as recently as a communication of yesterday makes us realise that the work will continue and must continue to provide justice and truth and reconciliation in this place. And I'll just finish with this. As I read this extraordinary book, and it tells the story of really 3 families, there was one moment in this book that gave me a fresh insight into the power of the church, but also the nature of the conspiracy of silence and the complicity. And I read this yesterday with the Nashes present, Audrey and Joseph present at the gathering outside the cathedral yesterday, and with their indulgence I'll do it again, because this is a passage that I've carried with me since I read it in Susie's book, and it's on Tuesday, the 8th of October 1974. And their boy has just been found hanging. His body is but 2 hours after that. And I'll read from Susie's book. 2 hours after Andrew's body had been found, the assistant parish priest, Father Bill Burston, arrived and administered the Catholic rites for people who had already died. Burston was a registered psychologist with a master's degree of psychology from the University College in Dublin. He was also the director of the Catholic Family Welfare Bureau, later known as Centrecare. He was new to the parish and Audrey hadn't met him before. He told her Carl was away. Shortly afterwards, 2 more priests arrived. Father Tom Brennan, the headmaster of St Pius, Jeffreys High School, and his deputy principal, Father Patrick Pat Helferty. Then 3 Marist brothers from Andrew's school were on the doorstep. The principal, Brother William Christopher Wade, Brother Romold Cable, Andrew's classmaster, and Andrew's footy coach, Brother John O'Brien. Audrey was surprised to see them all. She'd only asked for her parish priest. How did the Marist brothers find out so quickly, she wondered. The priests and brothers huddled in a circle in the cramped living room away from the family and spoke quietly to each other. In front of them all was a display of all the Nash family photos, nearly covering the entire wall, happy family shots. The men did not look up. They looked only at each other. Audrey was still in shock, and she gathered her thoughts as best she could. Her boys just died. Her mind turned to Andrew's quiet demeanour when she'd picked him up that afternoon. She faced Romold. Did anything happen at school? He broke away from the circle of men, but he ignored Audrey's question. He looked up at her while not meeting her eyes. Did Andrew leave a note? He asked. No, she told him. Did he say anything? Romold inquired. No. Audrey shook her head. Her sobs filled the house. The men spoke a few words of condolence before leaving the house, one by one. Those men came to conspire, to hide the truth, to find out if this boy had told the truth about his abuse. And they did that at that moment with that family in that moment of suffering. To all of you who have survived moments like that and thought you had no voice, your story would not be told. To the family of Father Glenn Walsh, all of our hearts go out to you. But I say to Susie, thank you for telling the truth. And I say to all of you, buy the book and read it. And let's make sure the truth is truly told. And when it comes to Glenn Walsh, let's collectively ask for the police to reopen an investigation into the death of that brave whistleblower priest. And let's have justice for Father Glenn Walsh as well. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Your next speaker was one of Australia's leading religion journalists. Stephen Crittenden is a former ABC colleague of Suzanne Smith, as well as Stephen Alwood. He worked as an investigative journalist during the 2013 Canine Special Inquiry into allegations of abuse within the Maitland-Newcastle Catholic Diocese being covered up. He then went on to the Child Abuse Royal Commission, where he was lead writer on the huge volume of the final report, which focused on religious institutions. He now works as Director of Professional Standards and Safeguarding for the Franciscan Friars and the Patrician Brothers. Please welcome Stephen Crittenden.
Thanks, Dan, and I should say I'm speaking in a personal capacity tonight as a friend and colleague of Mark and Stephen and Susie. Susie's book begins by evoking the landscape and the original owners of the land and naming a whole list of the local tribes of the area. And then there's the story of white settlement and the mining of that land and the working class suburbs and the very Catholic tribal nature of Newcastle in those times. It has a wonderful sense of place. I feel a close connection to this place too, because it was here that my father's ancestors first settled as small share farmers around Newcastle in these river flats around the 1840s. Susie's book does a great job of weaving a whole lot of strands and a whole lot of lives together into a single story, of which they are all a part. Each strand is someone's individual story. And as any writer or editor knows, that kind of interweaving is an exceedingly difficult thing to do, especially here where dates are so important, where there's so much going on during the same time period. the book has succeeded in pulling a whole lot of overlapping stories together. What comes through is a web of interrelationships. At the heart of the book is the relationship between two small boys in a working class neighbourhood who live in the same street and play together as kids and stay in touch as adults even though their paths diverge. And of course their separate stories are revealed to be part of the same horrific story of the many victims of child sexual abuse in this community who've taken their own lives. And of course Andrew Nash and his wonderful mother are also interwoven as part of that story. And of course there were so many other children who have had their childhoods robbed from them, who had their sense of trust in others shattered, and who may never have reached their full potential. There are other webs of relationships. The web of relationships between the clergy, between the perpetrators themselves, and between the perpetrators and the local church leadership. And just as an aside, I know that when they began investigating these clergy connections, some police, including Peter Fox, who's here tonight, were convinced that what they were going to find was a clergy pedophile ring. Susie's book certainly implies that Denham may have been involved in co-offending with one or two others, and there was probably other co-offending as well. But we know that co-offending among clergy child sex offenders was relatively unusual, other than in a closed residential institution such as children's homes. One of the purposes of grooming is to isolate the child, and the perpetrators themselves are often quite isolated figures. For example, no one was more isolated than Dennis McAlinden. Of all the Maitland Newcastle perpetrators, he's the one that comes to me in my dreams. He's the one that I know most about. And he was an outsider. At any rate, as the Royal Commission showed, what I and some of my colleagues became convinced of at the Royal Commission in relation to Maitland Newcastle was that rather than a ring of pedophiles, there was a ring of protection, and that story comes through loud and clear in this book. The book also shows the web of interconnected relationships that the clergy had with the families and the school teachers who made up the local Catholic community, and the relationships that the families had with each other, and other interwoven sets of relationships with and between the journalists and the police, and between the police, the journalists, the survivors and their families. Everywhere there's grief and pain and trauma. In fact, what makes this book special is the way it tells the story of the collective trauma associated with child sexual abuse, the story of the ripple effect through an entire community. This kind of storytelling is only possible because of the relationships and the trust and the warmth and the care that Susie built up over a long time with a whole range of people in this community. I can't tell you how much I've admired the way she's built and maintained lasting human relationships with the people at the centre of this story, sometimes very wounded people. She's always treated survivors as individuals. Of course, it's not only Susie. Joanne McCarthy has been the same kind of survivor-focused journalist. Someone like Helen Keevers also built relationships and put survivors first, as did police officers like Peter Fox and Troy Grant and Kirsty Faber. So although this community may have been very poorly served in other ways, in a certain sense, it's been surrounded by a ring of care and concern. As a journalist, I was very different as a personality to Susie. I always had my nose in a book and probably preferred books to people. And I know that I was very slow to make personal connections with survivors. But I like to think that I learnt by her example. And I think meeting Peter Gogarty for the first time was the breakthrough moment for me. At the Royal Commission, I found the same culture of profound concern for the welfare of survivors. I know that I felt, and that we all felt, and Susie has always felt, that we had a tremendous responsibility for the stories that we'd been entrusted with and the people who had entrusted them to us. Now, none of this happened by accident, and it wouldn't have happened without the style of journalism that people like Susie and Joanne have been doing. Newcastle University academic Kathleen McPhillips, who's here tonight, says that child sexual abuse is a kind of unbearable knowledge. It certainly proved to be unbearable for Stephen and Glenn and Andrew and many others. The abuse itself happens in secret. In fact, secrecy is one of its essential characteristics. The child is often threatened into keeping the secret, and because of the pain and the shame, the family or the institution where abuse sometimes occurs keeps it secret. And the survivor often carries the secret into adulthood, telling no one. And McPhillips says that this is one of the reasons why child sexual abuse in Australia and elsewhere has been so difficult for societies to address. She says that the research shows that it's been the subject of periods of collective amnesia, whereby it's discovered and then forgotten and then rediscovered again. But she says that in Australia, that all began to change in the 1990s with the inquiry into the stolen generations, when a commission of inquiry started to listen to the voices of the people who'd been victimised and abused. That was followed by the Senate inquiries into child migrants and Australians who grew up in care, and this process of listening to the voices of survivors really came to the fore with the Child Abuse Royal Commission. That listening to the voices of the marginalised, treating them as community elders that we can all learn from, has changed everything. It's been a kind of social revolution waged against institutional power and powerful men. And it's part of a much larger worldwide social revolution of which the We Too movement is a part. Speaking about trauma, I'd add that the Church itself is also going through a period of intense grief and trauma. I've come to understand from working on the inside that within the religious orders and the diocesan clergy, there are many good priests and religious who've dedicated their lives to helping others, who are traumatised by the fact that their colleagues they lived and worked alongside, sometimes for many years, abused the trust that was placed in them. Some are thinking about the abuse that they themselves have suffered inside the Church. When I was at the Royal Commission, the abuse of vulnerable adults was outside of our terms of reference, but I received a lot of information suggesting that the abuse of novices and seminarians has been a major issue. We're also increasingly hearing about the abuse of nuns by priests in particularly India and Africa. In fact, the Royal Commission heard evidence about half or more than half of the priests and religious who'd been sent to Encompass for treatment had abused adults. And Susie's book manages to weave that part of the story in too, because of course that's an essential part of Glenn's story. As with Stephen, he carried the pain throughout his life, and it's no doubt a factor in his willingness to identify with the victims and go to the police. Also, as the book shows, as a working priest, he was not only traumatised by the abuse he'd suffered, but also unquestionably by the fact that wherever he was appointed in Maitland, Newcastle, he was following perpetrated priests who'd been who'd been in those parishes. And he would have been dealing with parishioners who were traumatised, and he would have been dealing with his own trauma. I've got all kinds of connections with this story. Stephen and Mark and Susie have been my friends at the ABC since the early 90s. It was Stephen who gave me a job as the head of the religion department at Radio National, which set me on the path of investigating abuse in the Hunter region in the first place with Susie. We were in court in Sydney together the day Denham was sentenced in 2000. I'll never forget seeing him in the dock. So creepy it made you want to go out and take a shower. When Julia Gillard first announced the Royal Commission, the social workers warned that it would need to provide specially trained people to provide care and support for survivors throughout the life of the inquiry. And as many of you will know, those care workers were magnificent. They set the standard for how all such inquiries should be run in future. But it was inevitable that some survivors would be re-traumatised by the dreadful stories that came out of the Royal Commission day after day. In fact, year after year. In fact, I think it's likely that there were entire communities that were re-traumatised. It's clear that Stephen was one of those who was re-traumatised by the Royal Commission. And reading Susie's book last night, it hit me really for the first time that as he read through the pages of the final report in that last summer, of course, some of what he would have been reading would have been my work. Going back to the opening pages of Susie's book, where she names all those local tribes who lived here long before white settlement. What a terrific way to start the book. Because, of course, one of the many things we've learned from our First Nations peoples is the importance of story in Aboriginal culture and the way that story enters into you and you become part of it. The importance of being a custodian of the land and of the story. And so I guess that's where I want to land this evening. Everyone in this room is part of this story. It's entered into each of us. We've become part of it, and we have to continue to be custodians of this story and to look after each other. Susie's been a fine custodian of many Maitland Newcastle stories. What she didn't know at the outset, of course, of this long journey was that it would come so very close to home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Time now for something very special. Stephen Elwood's partner, Mark Wakely, has arranged for eminent concert pianist Gerard Willems to play for us tonight. It's a piece by Robert Schumann. Gerard came to fame being the first Australian pianist to record the complete series of 32 piano sonatas by Beethoven. Mark hopes that this piece tonight, that Gerard will introduce, will provide a moment of comfort and reflection for all of us gathered here tonight. We're soon to hear from the families of some of the men that we've lost, so consider this a gift from Mark. Would you please give Gerard Willems a warm Newcastle welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. It's a great honour for me to be here at this event, which is so important. And when Mark and Stephen were actually our friends for a long time, and they, as a couple, were great benefactors to the arts, and that's how I came to meet Mark and Stephen. And we had a lot of fun together, and when Stephen passed away, we were sorry, we consoled Mark, and it was a very difficult time. And when Mark suggested that I would play at this particular event, I immediately agreed, and I said, of course. But what shall I play? And we decided on something reflective, because there's a lot of pain in the room from people who had been dealt with in this terrible way. And to reflect about the intensity of it all, but let the piece be an antidote to these deep-rooted feelings. And we decided on a piece by Robert Schumann called Träumerei, which means dreaming. And it's actually from a set of pieces, Scenes for Childhood. And this makes it even more significant and fitting for the occasion, that these pieces were actually written about a child's fantasies and a child's dreaming and a child's truth and honesty and appreciation of beauty, but seen through the eyes of an adult, i.e. Robert Schumann. He himself had 8 children, and he knew what sadness was all about, because he died actually in his 40s of dementia, and he had a terrible ending to his life, and he had a very short life, but he produced 8 beautiful children, and this particular set of pieces would be we thought would be appropriate for tonight's event. So I'm going to play for you Träumerei of Robert Schumann.
Andrew Nash was a beautiful 13-year-old boy when he took his own life in 1974 because of the abuse he had endured. His abuse and suicide was a focus of the Child Abuse Royal Commission. Andrew's mother, Audrey, and his brother, Jeffrey, have fought for decades for their son and brother. They have never wavered in their commitment to get justice for him and every other person affected by clerical abuse. Would you please welcome to the stage Audrey and Jeffrey Nash.
Jared, thank you for the Schumann. That was beautiful. Thank you, Mark, for arranging that. Unfortunately, that shows us the beauty that human beings are capable of, that we should aspire to. Unfortunately, now I have to talk about the other side, the depravity that human beings are capable of. So please forgive me. On the cover of Susie's book is a photo of Andrew, Carmel and me. It was taken in 1967 in our backyard. I am the one in the altar boy garments, looking like a human sacrifice. I was 10 years old. The future seemed bright. Andrew and I were just kids, playing around having fun. Life was simple. We were altar boys in the Catholic Church in the Diocese of Maitland, Newcastle. What could go wrong? 7 years later, I would be cutting down my little brother's dead body. Andrew hung himself in his bedroom. He was 13 years old. 2 days later, I went to the morgue to identify his body, as my parents were in no condition to do so. The pedophiles in this diocese had a hunger for young children that knew no bounds. Children before us were abused, we were abused, our friends and classmates were abused, the children after us were abused. Children like Glenn and Stephen. The clergy preyed on the children of this diocese at every opportunity. At church, at school, in the presbytery, at camps, retreats, sporting events, in the family home, in the seminary. Catholic children weren't safe anywhere. I had the misfortune to attend two of the worst schools in Australia. Morris Brothers High School, Hamilton, where Andrew and I went with Glenn, and then I moved to St Pius X College, Adamstown, the same school that Stephen went to. The principals of both of these schools at the time were pedophiles. Brother Christopher Wade, who everyone referred to as Chuck, and Father Tom Brennan at Adamstown. There were many pedophiles on the staff of both schools, both religious and lay teachers. Many students had their lives destroyed by these people. Many students lost their lives at these two schools. I'm about to read a list of the offenders in the diocese over the last few decades. Many of these guys have been in jail, and some of them are currently in jail today as we speak. I should just say here I'm a big fan of the work of Troy Grant, Peter Fox and Christy Faber, current and former New South Wales police officers. I'm sure everyone here that's worked with those people thinks the same way. Yeah. The list of offenders in the diocese, I'll start with a priest. Father Albert Davis, Father David O'Hearn, Father Dennis Corrigan, Father Francis Donovan, Father Dennis McAlinden, Father Jim Fletcher, Father John Denham, Father Kenneth Hodgson, Father Peter Brock, Father Tom Brennan, Father Peter Quirk, Father Vince Ryan, Father William Cantwell, Father Guy Harcher. And then the Morris brothers, Brother Stephen Farrell, Brother Swithin Hosey, Brother Koska Shute, Brother Terry Gilsonen, Brother Colgan Taylor, Brother Terence Mulligan, Brother Romuald Cable, Brother Peter Pemble, Brother Patrick Butler, Brother Oswin McKinney, Brother Cashin Blackwood, Brother Nestor Littler, Brother Leon Mackey, Brother Dominic Gleeson, Brother Donald Newton, Brother Dominic O'Sullivan, and Brother Christopher Wade. And the lay teachers, Anthony Bamback, John Garn, Paul Lane, Ray Wine, Ted Hall, Louise Schmitz, and Terry Nolan. The diocese has admitted that Bishop Leo Clark and Monsignor Patrick Cotter concealed child sexual abuse. Father Tom Brennan and Brother Christopher Wade have both been convicted of concealing child sexual abuse. At this point, I wanted to thank Hilbert Chew for his brilliant and caring work for the Nash family. He is known in Newcastle now as the legendary Hilbert Chew. Susie's book features Hilbert's examination of Brother Christopher Wade and Father Bill Burston, which was the finest work that I saw in all the Royal Commission case studies that I attended. So Hilbert, thank you. As Susie's book clearly sets out, this list can only mean one thing: organised crime on a large scale. Susie's investigations have also revealed new offenders not on that list, so please read the book. I can't give it away. The criminal history of this diocese reads like the screenplay for a Quentin Tarantino movie. The crimes, the suffering, the carnage, the sheer horror of it all. There are other types of criminals in the diocese as well, not just child molesters, although child molesting is their core business. Father Jimmy Hughes, an Irish priest and close friend of Monsignor Patrick Cotter, is one of them. Amongst many Catholic women in the diocese, Father Hughes is referred to as the housekeeper rapist. My mother, Audrey Nash, held Glenn Walsh in the highest esteem. She told me recently Monsignor Alan Hart and Father Bill Burston weren't fit to shine Glenn's shoes. I love Glenn's line in Susie's book where he refers to Burston's disease, a disease that affects many priests in the diocese. Among the symptoms is a loss of memory, which leads to the repeated claim of, "I don't recall." How many times have we heard that phrase from members of the clergy in this diocese? I'd like to take this opportunity to call on Bishop Bill Wright and the Diocese of Maitland Newcastle to build a memorial in the grounds of St Pius X College, Adamstown, and also to build a memorial in the grounds of the Sacred Heart Cathedral, Hamilton. The victims, the survivors and their families deserve this. The Church owes these people. Yeah. They have waited long enough. Please show them the pastoral care you promised them. A good starting point would be to look up your own canon law, Book 2, which is called The People of God, Chapter 6, Canon 515. In the week after my brother Andrew died, Marish brothers and a priest of the diocese fabricated stories about his death. Father Bill Burston told the Hamilton altar boys, Andrew's friends, that Andrew died playing hide-and-go-seek with his little sister. A Marish brother told his class that I shut the door on him, his school tie was caught in the door and he was strangled. Another Marish brother told his class that Andrew and I were playing on the Hills Hoist clothesline in the backyard. Andrew became entangled and died. There is now a fourth story. Father Andrew Murray, a Marish priest living in Sydney, told my mother this story a few months ago. They were talking about the ABC documentary Revelation at the time. Father Andrew told Audrey that Andrew died as a result of an autoerotic sexual activity. For those of you who aren't sure what that means, it means that Father Murray said Andrew Nash was masturbating while strangling himself. He went too far and died. That's right, a 13-year-old boy in Hamilton in 1974. What sort of idiot would ring up a 94-year-old mother and tell her this garbage about her dead 13-year-old son? That's right, a priest. A man with no children. Just like all the guys that I read out before. No children. They don't use their own children. They use the children of the Catholic families in the diocese. Children like Andrew and Stephen and Glenn. As Father Burston said on Revelation in 2020, I've had enough of Andrew Nash. Father Burston must have missed the classes on pastoral care at the seminary in Rome. Or maybe there just weren't any classes on pastoral care. My mother, Audrey, has asked me to read the following statement. Father Burston and Father Murray, I, Audrey Nash, my children, my grandchildren and my great-granddaughter would like you both to shut up and never mention my son Andrew's name again. Thank you.
I would like to thank Susie for writing this book. I think she's done a fantastic job, and hopefully something will come of it. The 3 tragic stories in Susie's book are only the tip of the iceberg in this diocese. The priest and brothers are responsible for hundreds of victims whose lives have been ruined as they suffer the pain and misery every day. And those men and boys that took their own lives to escape the horrors they endured. Glenn was my friend. He was a lovely, caring human being, and I miss him very much. He was devastated when he was told to leave the diocese. He always wanted to come back. Glenn came to Hamilton to attend a prison mass during an Easter week. That's where all the priests from the diocese are in the one mass. He told me later that Mons Cotter, Mons Hart, Father Tunks and many others would not even acknowledge him that he was there. The treatment of Glenn by the clergy of this diocese was diabolical and appalling. We were told as children that these priests were Christ's representatives on earth, so God help us. They should all hang their heads in shame. That was the treatment that he got from the fellow priest for standing up for the truth. My family and I will give all our full support to David for his fight for a coronial inquest into Glenn's death. Thank you.
This is great. I can't see you. I think I'm here on my own. Thank you very much, Dan. I'm here this evening representing my brother Peter, my sister Libby, Stephen's life partner Mark Wakely, and our families. I've also been asked by the family of Father Glenn Walsh, his mother and father Louise and John, his siblings John, Marie, Patricia and Kathleen, and their families to say a few words on their behalf also. And I just want to let you know that John Jr. and Tricia are here tonight, and we welcome them very much. Father Glenn Walsh was inflicted with the greatest travesty of justice in this whole sorry saga of clergy abuse. A priest who, despite all attempts by his superiors to dissuade him from exposing the abuse carried out by his fellow priests, stuck to his guns, kept his faith, and endured all of the absolutely abhorrent treatment directed toward him. Bear in mind that this treatment came from a bishop, an archbishop, and fellow clergy within the Newcastle Maitland Diocese. This unbearable treatment over many years ultimately resulting in Glenn taking his life on the 6th of November 2017. The Elwood family has a long-standing connection with the Walshes, having lived a few doors up from them in Shortland and growing up with them in our formative years. Stephen going right through primary school with Glenn and staying in touch with him through his adult life. The news of Glenn's death had a devastating effect on our brother Stephen and was the catalyst for some very unusual behaviour by him. Let me share with you some of Stephen's life up to that point. He was the baby of the family, really close to Mum, and also learned to cook from her. His specialty was boiled fruitcake. He was always the star, excelling at school and a great friend to all. Imagine the shock to him when he came out to our beloved Mum and was ordered out of the family home at 18. In time, this situation was restored and he was again back in favour, with Mum accepting partner Mark into the family. Stephen had an extraordinary life until his passing. He still had contact and regular involvement with a lot of his school friends, including Ian Andrews, Kira Hendry, Janelle Garrett and Kate Bartlett. And thank God some of them are here with us tonight to witness this. In 1979, while Stephen was a cadet journalist at the Newcastle Herald, he met his life partner Mark Wakely, a journalist also at the Herald, with whom he went on to share a full and loving partnership that lasted till his passing in 2018. Both Mark and Stephen reached the top in their journalistic careers and on the way through travelling the world extensively. Mark also publishing 2 books. Stephen penning one, it's yet to be published, and cultivating their love of art and a very handsome collection of commissioned artworks and sculptures, as well as financially supporting the Art Gallery of New South Wales and the Newcastle Art Gallery. They also supported, and Mark's continuing to support, the Omega Ensemble, commissioning many works by them. Stephen and Mark threw themselves into a massive campaign to make sure they did everything in their power to assist with the passing of the gay marriage plebiscite. Not so much for themselves, but for all those coming behind them, not having to endure the prejudice that they themselves had directed at them. All the while, Stephen was harbouring various levels of depression as a result of his abuse at the hands of Father John Denham. His abuse not being revealed until a short time before he took his life. Susie Smith introduced us to the Clergy Abuse Network not long after Stephen's passing. That meeting opened our eyes to the level of abuse and how it affected the survivors and their families and provided support for us when it was needed most. CAN provides access to fellowship and support services to victims and their families who have been caught up in this most vulgar of crimes. My wife Therese, my sister Libby and myself continue to be members of the Clergy Abuse Network and feel privileged that we can now be part of that support group for the survivors and their families. Robert O'Toole with others started CAN and at a request from a former survivor mapped over 70 suicides in the Catholic high schools in Newcastle. 70. And they came from 3 only schools: the Marsh Brothers at Hamilton, the Marsh Brothers at Maitland and St Pius X at Adamstown. I'd like to now move on to the reason we're here tonight, and that's the launch of Susie Smith's book, The Altar Boys. We are so grateful to this absolutely outstanding journalist who started out as a friend and colleague of Stephen and Mark's and finished up a true and trusted friend to us all, keeping us all up to speed every step of the way through the writing process. My brother Peter, Mark, my brother-in-law, and myself have all read the book. Libby, my sister, a little slower, is currently reading the book and is finding it both confronting and moving. As for the 3 boys, the best I can probably do for you is to read an extract from the response from each of us to Susie via our emails. From myself. Susie, as you know, I received my copy on Thursday afternoon and have just completed reading it. I can only say congratulations, Susie. The book is extremely well written. I love the format, and you have done our little brother, his siblings, family and his life partner proud and told our stories with empathy and compassion. Love, David. And from Peter, Susie, you honour our beautiful brother Stephen and all of those other victims and their families, some of whom have not stood up and voiced their anger over these awful events. Thank you so much for presenting the true story and the way you have dealt with us, the Elwood family, as a true professional with caring and understanding. Love, Peter. And from Mark, while Stephen would have found our telling of his own story difficult to read, as I did, and no doubt anyone who loves him would, I know how hard it was for you to tell. However, what would fill Stephen with great satisfaction and pride is that finally the devastating, unfair story of his childhood friend Glenn Walsh has been told for the world to know what this brave and decent man has suffered. That's what Stephen Elwood asked this reporter Suzanne Smith to do when he emailed her only months before he took his life. He must have thought she was a pretty fine journalist and well cut out for the job. And despite doubts, difficulties and immense emotional strain, Susie Smith has proven that Stephen Elwood was totally right to put his faith in her to produce something monumentally important. This is a remarkable tribute to the memory of my beloved Stephen and all the lost boys and men who were so wronged but remain loved so dearly. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, Susie. Stephen will be very, very proud of you. Love, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. So let's hear from Susie, shall we? She's an award-winning investigative journalist and she looks way too young for this next comment, but she has been for nearly 30 years working at the ABC for foreign correspondent, background briefing, Radio National, ABC News and Current Affairs, and she was the senior investigative reporter and producer at Lateline when she started reporting on the cover-up of clerical abuse. And that, of course, alongside Joanne McCarthy, helped trigger the Child Sexual Abuse Royal Commission. One thing I've learned about Susie while working alongside her is that she is like a dog with a bone. That phrase was made for you, Susie. She's determined and she refuses to give up. And that is, of course, the best kind of investigative journalist. She's also a bloody good human being. This book has 16 pages of end notes in size 10 font. The research she has done to bring you, the altar boys, is extraordinary. And, as David mentioned, it honours Andrew, Stephen and Glenn. Please give a warm Newcastle welcome to Susie Smith. Susie, you have been covering this issue for a decade or more. Why did you write a narrative non-fiction? Why write a book?
Well, really, it's Stephen Elwood's last commission, that's what I'm calling it. I'd worked for Lateline for 15 years, and 8 of those years I'd covered Newcastle Maitland. I think I did 40 stories, and you and I were together at the Crittenden inquiry, and there would have been at least 20 stories there. To be honest, I was pretty traumatised, and I decided to go to foreign correspondent because I'd done a whole lot of child sexual abuse stories, and they're corrosive, and it's very hard on my family. Anyway, I had covered Archbishop Philip Wilson, as you know, with Peter Gogarty and what role he'd played in the diocese. And the court case was coming up, and I noticed there was this priest, Father Glenn Walsh. After the Crittenden inquiry, we found out Father Glenn Walsh had become a Crown prosecution witness. Now, this is very rare. This doesn't happen, that priests do this, and I was intrigued by it. And then 2 weeks before Archbishop Philip Wilson's trial, he suicided. And that's when Stephen got in touch with me and said, Susie, I grew up with Glenn from the age of 2, and you really should investigate his death. And I thought, all right, well, that's really interesting. A priest doing that, that's very interesting. I was going to Hawaii in December and he was off to Chile with Mark, and I wanted to meet him in January, but when I went to contact him, he'd suicided, and we were all shocked and devastated. And then this is how spooky this story is, and I'm no longer religious, right? But I decided to attend the outcome of the Archbishop Philip Wilson trial in Newcastle because I'd covered it. And I was going to go with Helen Kivers, who was also in the book, and she was a great woman, courageous woman, and a social worker who'd worked inside the diocese.
She was keen to write a book like this, wasn't she?
Well, she was going to write the book. I was going to help her write the book. Anyway, and her family here tonight, so good on Helen. Anyway, Helen and I agreed to meet at the decision in the Archbishop Philip Wilson case, and then she died the week before. And all these people that, you know, these two people that meant a lot to me had died. Glenn had died. And then I'm in the courtroom and I'm crying because he was convicted. And this woman comes up to me and says, "It's such a pity Glenn Walsh wasn't here. You know, he even got recalled to see the Pope." And I said to this woman, "Hold on a minute, that doesn't sound right. Why was he recalled to see the Pope?" Anyway, this woman was Glenn's former lawyer. She claimed she didn't know I was a journalist. And from that point on, we had a coffee or two, and then I realised Stephen's editorial judgment was always spot on. He was one of the best journalists, and he knew there was a great story here, and he'd been in touch with Glenn. He'd named Monsignor Alan Hart as one of the people that had bullied Glenn, and then I met his former lawyer in the courtroom, and I thought, yep, this is my destiny, I've got to write this book. And I think now, looking at it, I've been so privileged and honoured that so many people have come forward and told me their stories now. They've all felt it's got to be done now. We've got to actually put it all down in a book, mark it for history. That's why I wrote the book.
One of the things that has come up tonight is that it does honour all three men, Andrew being a boy, but Glenn and Stephen also. So well done on that. I want to touch on Glenn's meeting with the Pope. It's not every local priest that gets to have a meeting in the Vatican with the Pope. Tell us about that. It's just extraordinary.
So Senator David Shoebridge did the numbers. 400,000 priests in the world or something, David, and Glenn gets the one-on-one with an interpreter. Extraordinary.
Because he was a whistleblower?
Well, no, after Archbishop Philip Wilson was charged and he was a prosecution witness, he gets invited, and from what Glenn's told quite a few people, and from other sources, the Pope thought he was suing the Archbishop. He didn't quite understand. This is what Glenn said, what the big deal was, asked him about the case. And then, of course, the extraordinary story of when he comes out of the room with Pope Francis, Cardinal Pell's there and says, "Look what I've done for you, kiss my ring." I mean, you couldn't, you'd have to, the ego of the man. But what struck me was, this is very interesting. What was, and I'm sure Glenn's story is true, and there's no vested interest in Glenn Walsh telling that story. He didn't know it was going to become public. He didn't know he'd be part of a book. What was the reason Cardinal Pell would do that? Was he saying, this is the world you could inhabit, or, you know? And that's why it's really important we get to the bottom of what all this litany of things that happened to Glenn Walsh before he died. When he was, you know, you're not supposed to meddle with the prosecution witnesses, are you?
Susie, I grew up here. I love this city and this region, and I'm really proud of it. But one of the reasons I'm not proud is because of the number of pedophile priests that we have here. It's out of proportion to the rest of the country. Why do you think, after all these years of investigating child sexual abuse within institutions, but especially the Catholic Church, why do you think sexual abuse is so prevalent in the Hunter and in our region's schools?
I go into that in the book. We start with the colony. It was a very punitive place, and then the immigration of Catholic families from Northern England and Ireland, and the importation of that harsh Irish Catholic culture and discipline, and then just, you know, the numbers of priests and brothers, the men working 3 jobs, the fact, I mean, I can't give you a definitive answer, but I think what I'm trying to explain in the book is there's a recipe for a disaster, and they had all the elements here. At the top, you had a criminal class in the Catholic Church of the hierarchy that did not obey our civil laws. They had their own canon laws and their own culture. Detective Sergeant Christy Faber, who's here tonight, understands this very well, and she's a big character in my book. And we should pay tribute to her tonight because she tells that very well in the book, and she has prosecuted 19 priests and brothers, and her team at Strikeforce Georgiana have been incredible. And can I point out that Troy Grant and Peter Fox are here too. What changed with Troy Grant when he did his prosecution of Ryan? It wasn't until police like Troy Grant and Christy Faber and Peter, the police culture changed as well, and they weren't going to be in awe of Catholic culture and Catholic power and influence and the influence of the hierarchy. They were going to make sure the rule of law was followed, and that's when things changed. So I think prior to that, prior to those sort of amazing police, what sort of deals were done and what sort of, sweeping things under the carpet. Because I grew up in a Catholic family. When a priest came into my home, it was like, God came into the home, all that sort of thing. And, the Catholic Church and the hierarchy were treated as gods, as if they could do no wrong. And I sort of chart that in the book with these sort of deals that were done at the top level with the police.
I have always wondered, and you touched on this, according to Detective Sergeant Christy Faber, that these men were pedophiles that became priests, that it was actually just the perfect place to hide. Yes,
that's right. And they could hide because the hierarchy were criminals. And so many secrets, the secrets start in the novitiates and in the seminaries, and that's where the culture's laid down, and then it carries on to when they're then sent out into schools and end up in places like this in the hierarchy. And that's why you perpetrate all these secrets. People have dirt on each other, canon laws not followed, and so that's the recipe, really.
Tell us about blind reporting, and I only ask about it because it does come up several times in the book, and it is an extraordinary thing, and it's actually really crucial to why this was swept under the carpet and or covered up.
Well, it was actually Senator David Shoebridge and I who did all these FOIs when I was at Lateline. It's really interesting that a lot of my work at Lateline's become really relevant to this book, and I can actually draw on it. And when we did these FOIs on the police at the time, Father Brian Lucas, he interviewed 15 pedophiles but hasn't been charged yet. Interesting. Didn't report them to the police, claiming privacy or something. Anyway, he came up with this ingenious scheme that the church hierarchy could fill in these blind reports with the victims and send them into the police, and then that would try and get them around this very prickly Section 316 of the Crimes Act. And partly Troy Grant was one of the people that caused them so much bother, because it was Troy Grant who wanted to use Section 316 on Monsignor Patrick Cotter, and it was only that the DPP didn't let him do that. Under New South Wales law, Section 316 is misprision of felony. I think that's how you pronounce it. And if you know that a crime's been committed and you don't report it, that's a crime. And it's such a tragedy that Troy tried to get the DPP to prosecute Monsignor Patrick Cotter back in 1996, and if that had occurred, imagine the message that would have sent to the hierarchy. So thank you, Troy, for doing that. Anyway, Brian Lucas was very worried about the Wood Royal Commission because suddenly they were updating all the legislation and they were going to, define what child sexual assault and abuse was. And so he came up with this ingenious scheme. We just get all the victims to... The church became their agent. That's the other thing. The agent between the victim and the police. And they were sending in all these blind reports. But we don't know. And often it was during negotiations with the victims over their compensation, their medical bills. And Operation Protea Police Integrity Commission had their inquiry and they found it to be in breach of Section 316. But I think, well, goodness gracious. Why did the senior police at the time, agree to that scheme. And then you have these great cops down the bottom trying to actually stop this abuse. So
Glenn was treated very badly by the diocese and its bishops over decades, and we heard tonight even the current bishop treated Glenn Walsh badly, and he was about to testify against Archbishop Philip Wilson. From what you've learnt and in speaking to the family, what was it, after years of fighting for this and being a whistleblower, what was it that changed that that was it? Like, he couldn't do it anymore?
do you mean towards the end of his life? His family here, and they'll have a better answer to me. I just got access to his emails. And I can't imagine what Glenn had been through. He must have been thinking, what are they going to do to me in that trial? He sends an email to someone on the 27th of October, and about 3 weeks before the trial, and says that Bishop Bill Wright came to visit him and told him he had no place in the diocese, that he'd help him find something overseas, that he was disliked intensely by the Presbyteriate, which is the rest of the priests, and he was devastated by that. There were so many instances where he wasn't treated with the respect that he deserved, so I just can't imagine what he went through.
What about Stephen? He was enjoying retirement, about to marry his partner of 38 years, Mark. You say in the book, it seems he would have been at the happiest he ever would have been. In your investigation and in speaking with the family, what happened for him?
I think, and I've got this from the family, so I think the beginning of the end was when Denham refused to see him. We've got the letters between Denham and him.
He had accepted the offer of Stephen and his brother making the way to Goulburn, and he gets to Goulburn jail and isn't allowed.
And how brave was he to go there and to say, you duped me, you, someone who'd been his mentor and teacher for so many years, and that he disclosed to Peter on the way down, and he gets there and the perpetrator has the final power, took the power from him. And he was going to write a piece about Denham and call it The Betrayal. So
I've got a few more questions, but I'd rather you ask them. I've got a few minutes. I don't know if we can raise the house lights slightly for us, but there is a microphone down this way, I believe.
And you don't have to ask anything, of course.
Do you have any questions for Susie? Anything you want to ask? The question is, did you get any pushback from priests or parishioners? Did they know you were writing this book?
I asked Bishop Bill Wright on several occasions to talk to me and to do an interview. I sent them questions. They refused. About 2 weeks ago, they just sent me a legal letter saying I'm not allowed to use any of the photos from the school yearbooks. So that was the... look, I think they know that there's so much more to what happened, and someone who read my book recently said to me, there'll be a lot of people in the mainland Newcastle area just waiting for the phone call, and I think there's just so many people here still that haven't come forward and haven't told their stories, and I think that's why the diocese is very reticent to involve themselves in any stories like this.
And what did we hear from tonight? One of your speakers said, is it 70 suicides? Bob O'Toole has been putting that list together. 70 people have died because of abuse or risky behaviour.
Yeah. And in my book I quote Christy Faber saying, well, you haven't got them all. So that's the thing when you talk about history, it's not historical. These people are living with this now and people are still taking their lives. So.
Any other questions for Susie?
Yes, please. Excuse me, Susie, did you have an opportunity to talk to the former Bishop Michael?
I did.
I'll just repeat the question for the record because we are recording tonight. Did you get to speak with Bishop Malone while researching the book?
I did meet with Bishop Malone once, but he didn't want to go on the record about anything, and he wouldn't give me a formal interview. He did provide me with some very glowing information about Helen Keevers, which is in the book. And Bishop Malone is a very interesting character, and I think Stephen Crittenden has picked that up. I don't know if enigmatic is the word, but very, very interesting character. And yes, that certainly comes out in the book when you read it. I need to acknowledge someone in the room who's... I wouldn't have written this book without my husband, James Fitzgerald, who's sitting up there. My family have suffered over the last 2 years. It's the one thing. And my daughter Gabrielle is on the train and is late. Where is she? I need to acknowledge my family. I need to acknowledge that they have suffered the last 2 years, and I couldn't have done it without them. It was such a hard thing to do. Because I was writing about someone who I really cared about, and I cared about Helen Keevers too. And these incredible people. If I could sum it up, there's all these incredible people, brave, courageous people. There's the cops. There's the John Wakely who's in the audience. What a champion! What a champion! Principal of 10 primary schools. Can't see anyone. Principal of 10 primary schools stood up to Father Peter Brock. Was betrayed. Tried to raise the alarm. How many people in this room have tried to raise the alarm? Courageous, brilliant people.
Susie, what's next? Maybe a narrative fiction?
No more. But I promised my husband and Gabby and Bella's not here, she's at ANU, that no more books. But
no more books?
This will be my last hurrah, and you've all got to keep me to that.
Did I hear a mention of a podcast, though? Is there something?
Yes, look, Audible are very interested in a podcast, so luckily I've recorded most of your interviews, but we might make a podcast. I might enlist someone in Newcastle to help me make that. But I just want to say it's been such an honour to meet all you Novocastrians. You're quite incredible. You're so authentic, and just what an incredible room of people. And it's just been an honour and a privilege to get to know you and tell your story. And Stephen Crittenden, that speech, my God, we are all part of this story. And we mustn't forget Father Glenn Walsh and what he went through. And I hope the New South Wales Police, Attorney General, whatever it takes, we have to get to the bottom of what happened to him. Because he was an insider who tried to change the culture. And if they can do that to people like him, nothing is going to change. Nothing is going to change.
Susie, congratulations on your book, The Altar Boys. Thank you for honouring the memory of Andrew Nash, Father Glenn Walsh and Stephen Alwood. I love that you call it Stephen's final commission to you as editor. Congratulations. Please put your hands together for Susie Smith.
Thank you.
That concludes tonight's launch.